It lasted for 21 years, making it one of the longest-running West End musicals ever, but for cast and crew in 1981, it was a real shot in the dark. Now on Radio 4, Elaine Paige, Bonnie Langford, Trevor Nunn, John Napier, Paul Nicholas and Wayne Sleep joined Sue MacGregor for the reunion of Cats the Musical.
It has to be said that Cats the Musical, even though it was a new effort from a highly successful team of professionals, did not at first sound a very promising prospect. It was the musical that almost didn't make it, despite its starry cast. It didn't have a script as such, so the narrative might be difficult to establish. Instead, its inspiration was a pre-war collection of poems about cats, published by the Nobel Prize-winning, highly intellectual, American-born poet TS Eliot, and not necessarily familiar to the audience. This in turn made it difficult to find the right financial backing. The West End in the 60s and 70s had featured a lot of musicals, but the big hitters were mainly American imports like Showboat, Company, Gypsy, A Chorus Line and Annie. Change began in 1968 with a series of collaborations between Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, starting with Joseph and His Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, through to Jesus Christ Superstar in 71, and finally Evita in 78. But their partnership came to an end, and by the start of the 1980s, the West End, like the rest of the country, was suffering from the effects of a recession. Despite the financial gloom of the time, Andrew Lloyd Webber was determined to continue his run of successes, and so he turned for inspiration to the work of one of Britain's foremost poets of the 20th century.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing...
T.S. Eliot, who died in 1965, was perhaps best known for his epic 1921 poem, The Waste Land. But it was a later work that caught Lloyd Webber's attention, his altogether more whimsical 1939 collection, Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats.
The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your holiday games. You may think at first I'm as mad as a hatter when I tell you a cat must have 3 different names.
Andrew Lloyd Webber came to see me.
T.S. Eliot's literary executor was his widow, Valerie Eliot, speaking here to Howard Rogers on Radio 4's PM in 1980.
It's going to be a rock score. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's delightful. I've heard it. I'm sure my husband would have thoroughly enjoyed it.
But there was one vital stipulation about allowing Lloyd Webber the right to adapt the poems into a musical.
She said, well, the thing is that Tom, that's T.S. Eliot, turned down Disney, because he didn't want them to be pussycats or turned into cartoon cats. I then said, well, I was sort of seeing them a little bit more like hot gossip. And she said, yes, she said, that I think Tom would have liked that.
The 70s dance group Hot Gossip were famous for their leotards and rather raunchy performances, and featured Sarah Brightman in their 1979 disco hit I Lost My Heart to a Starship Trooper. Valerie Eliot also gave Lloyd Webber some unpublished cat poems that her husband had discarded.
The unpublished material contains a whole dimension that is perhaps not in the original book. There's a wonderful cat called Grizabella the Glamour Cat. When we came across these pieces, it was too good for belief.
He approached the rising West End impresario Cameron Mackintosh.
When Andrew first played me some of the songs, it was his idea to perhaps do a sort of modern version of Facade. And when we hawked it around to find a director-choreographer, everybody said these cat poems are gloom, doom and disaster. Leave them alone, boys.
Different lyrics were tried out, including what was to go on to be the show's major hit, Memory. The choreographer, given the task of bringing feline qualities to two-legged humans, was Gillian Lynn.
We were so up against it for time, and it was a very hard show to get the kids through. I don't think we thought about whether we would be a hit or not. We were just praying we could even open.
All was not well, as Cameron Mackintosh revealed.
There was definitely a point when both Andrew and I during what seemed to be the longest technical period in history, went walking round London trying to find a bar that was open, as we couldn't think that this show was ever going to come together.
Well, I'm joined round the table by 6 people intimately connected to that original 1981 production of Cats. The director, now Sir Trevor Nunn, the set designer and designer of costumes, John Napier, and the performers Bonnie Langford, Paul Nicholas, Wayne Sleep and Elaine Paige. Bonnie Langford, you even then, as a kid, if I may say so, were a very experienced actor and singer and dancer. This sounds like a pretty stressful show to be in at that point.
Well, I was 16 at the time. I had literally just not long left school, but I had been in quite a few shows prior to that. But I was very excited to be in something that seemed to be so innovative and different, but it was quite chaotic, and there was an awful lot of drama involved. You know, in the rehearsal room alone, people were getting injured, choreography was very different, there were mixtures of styles. You know, it was a wonderfully eclectic mixture of a company.
Wayne Sleep, you have been a famous dancer, Royal Ballet, for ages. How easy or difficult was it for you to fit into the concept of Cats?
I would certainly not have worn a fur tail and a fluffy outfit looking like a little cat. That was the great genius of John Napier, not to go down that road. We had yak hair wigs, which were very light. The costume was lycra. The tail, made of rope, however, had a few contingencies about it. You had to hold on to it occasionally to spin, because it would pull you into the orchestra pit. But
you're looking at John Napier there, because as I said at the beginning, I think, as well as doing the set, you did a lot of the costumes, designed them.
Indeed, but it was exceedingly hard to do. I mean, I'd done some anthropomorphic costumes before. So I did equus, so I knew about horses, but I didn't know very much about cats. And partly going to rehearsal and seeing people in leg warmers and arm warmers gave proportion of cat, because what it did was thicken up the wrist and the bottom of the legs. It suddenly gave you a balance. And I did a huge amount of the costumes on the staircase at the New London Theatre. You know, I was painting people as they were going up and down the stairs.
And Paul Nicholas, you were a pretty experienced performer. Was it difficult to rehearse?
Basically, I'd had a bit of history with Andrew Lloyd Webber, because in 1972 I did the original production of Jesus Christ Superstar.
So he knew you pretty well.
So he knew me pretty well. And he gave me a call around 1980 and said, "Do you know old Possum's book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot?" I said, "Of course."
Were you a fibber?
It's by my bed at the moment.
You were a fibber?
I was a terrible fibber. And anyway, he said, "I've set these poems to music. Would you pop round and have a listen?" So I went round to his house, and he played me and sang the songs. We heard a snap of that earlier. And he said, "I'm going to do a workshop of it." He's got a church in his back garden, but then... Sidmonton. And every year he
Which became very important.
Yeah, it becomes... It's a festival. So he thought that he would like to try out this new show called Cats, along with 2 other actors, Gemma Craven and Gary Bond. And indeed, we went along, had an audience of 200 people, performed all these songs, and people seemed to love it. He had the song called Magical Mr Mistoffelees. But the problem with that number was, I always felt that it wasn't a Don't Cry For Me Argentina. But what was interesting, on the first day of rehearsal, he came in with the theme, the song, the tune of Memory. He didn't have a lyric at that point. And he played that song, and I thought, that's the song.
Trevor Nunn?
It was extraordinarily emotional. I remember saying to everybody, "Hey, remember the date, remember the time. We've just heard a piece of music that's going to go to #1 round the world." I mean, it was that sort of impact that it made on us. But going back to the very beginning of the show, one thing that I think has to be established in this conversation is the ruling made by the Eliot estate, and indeed by Valerie Eliot, that no word in the show could appear if it hadn't been written by T.S. Eliot. But the huge change, 2/3 of the way through rehearsal, was when Valerie Eliot phoned Andrew and said, we have discovered a page of typescript that Tom had written about a cat, and he'd scribbled next to it, "Too sad for children," and therefore didn't include it in the publication. Would you like to see it? I remember calling Andrew and saying, this changes absolutely everything. This gives us a narrative that we've never had before. And the poem was called Grizabella the Glamour Cat, a story of a stricken creature, a creature who has grown old, who is facing death. So some sort of notion of mortality could come into the story. That gave us a dimension that didn't exist before. But that meant there had to be an utterance for Grizabella, preferably a major utterance for Grizabella, an 11 o'clock number, if that's what the whole storyline was building to.
Elaine Paige, this was a pretty stressful time for you too, because everyone else had been rehearsing for weeks and you hadn't.
Well, that's right. I mean, I came to this project rather late in the day, and my involvement came after, well, strangely, I was driving home one night in my car, and on the radio I heard a fragment of a wonderful melody, and the DJ said, I will play the whole of the theme to Andrew Lloyd Webber's new musical Cats after the midnight news. And so I got home and I was fumbling around in my bag to get the keys to run into my house to record this song. I looked down and saw there, sort of just near me, was this sort of black, mangy, thin, bedraggled cat standing there, and I had only just left Evita a few months prior, so I was resting, as we say, in the business, and hoping and waiting for something to be offered to me. And there was this cat, and my mother had always said to me, if a black cat crosses your path, it brings you luck. And I ran into the house, set the tape up, recorded it, left the front door open, looked back, and this poor old mangy stray cat was sort of staggering into my house. So the cat stayed the night. I went to bed with this tune rolling around in my head on my Sony Walkman, I think it was at the time, and I thought, this is the kind of song for me.
John Napier, I mentioned you in coincidence with costumes, but you were really famous as a set designer, and you did something particularly special and brilliant, in fact, for Cats.
Well, that's not for me to say.
Well, everybody else did.
The word Briz, but
I've still got your design.
I'd love to tell you. I'd love to tell you just before, because I want to say how totally brilliant what he did was that. Where do we place this? Where do we place this? And in conversation with John, I just made the observation that one of Eliot's most famous, serious, long poems was called The Wasteland. What about we do something like a wasteland? And he then said, or you mean like a rubbish dump? And suddenly it was tingling, and then he said, oh my God, a garbage and everything then suddenly came into place. And then the genius was that everything on that rubbish dump was then created cat scale.
Because we didn't have the narrative of a conventional script, I was absolutely determined to make this thing streetwise, funky, a bit punkish, and not at all what you would expect from a musical. And then I thought, well, it's got to be a space that I can improvise in, so that you could turn cats into dogs, or you could make a railway train, or you could do many things.
You had a revolve, didn't you, stage? And the audience, I saw the show, but the audience ended up in a different place from where they started.
Well, I mean, that piece of equipment existed in the New London Theatre, but actually the capacity of the New London Theatre and the way that it was structured at that time was 900 seats, and this could not break even in terms of the numbers of people in there unless I managed to get another 200 seats into the theatre. So my job was not just designing the damn thing, it was actually making it viable.
Rebuilding the theatre.
Rebuilding the theatre, exactly.
Bonnie?
The stage itself was blocked because they felt they couldn't see, so people would always complain and say, I'm sorry, I've paid top price for these tickets and I can't see the stage. So we would have to deal with the fact that most of the audience were complaining about that. Then, of course, half the audience were on this revolve. And I remember, Trevor, you saying to us that we want it to feel like they're on a station platform when a train is first moving out of the station and you're never quite sure whether you're moving on the platform or whether you're moving on the train. So it gives that eerie quality.
Wayne Sleep?
We had the edge of the stage right into the front row. And I remember doing a jump, and I misplaced it this time. I think it only happened once. But I had to do this jump holding onto my leg and go into a forward row somersault and end in arabesque. And I landed in the first row in a seat with my leg between this woman's legs, and it was the only thing that was actually holding me up. But I never did that again.
There is a key role that we have just heard a little bit hint of, which is the choreographer and Gillian Lynn. Mm-hmm. And she, alas, is no longer with us, but she is much loved in the dance world and outside it as well.
Well,
Wayne?
She and I came from the same source. We were both with the Royal Ballet, so we came from a classical world.
I want to ask you, Paul, Nicholas, because you're admittedly not a trained dancer, but you worked for... There's a tiny little
I am light
giggle.
on my feet.
a little laugh went round.
Gillian Lynn made you do 2 weeks previous to us rehearsal.
You and Brian Blessed.
No, what happened was I had to go in, I think it was as much as 8 weeks prior to the rehearsal period. And I think Gillian, because she was a perfectionist, wanted to make sure that I was at a good enough standard not to let the show down. I had a number called the Rum Tum Tugger, and during the middle of this song, there's a big dance break. So I said to Gillian, well, I'm still not quite as good as everyone else, so could I run into the audience at that point and spray them as if they smell? Being a cat. But apparently that wasn't taken, but they did allow me into the audience, and it became a bit of a feature because I found various stars like Prince Charles and people like that and ruffled their hair. And
You ruffled the hair of Prince Charles?
I'm afraid I did, yes. That, of course, is when he had hair, yes.
But if he ever discovered there was a bald head, he would then slowly kiss the bald head, which would bring the house down.
Brilliant.
I mean,
Brilliant.
Absolutely so mischievous.
Tickets for Cats first went on sale in early 1981.
Say Magical Mr Mistoffelees, which is one of the most...
Meanwhile, Lloyd Webber was still writing the songs. Speaking to Bob Wellings on the BBC's On the Town, he gave a preview of how things were coming along.
Like this. Say, oh, well, I never was there ever a cat so clever as magical Mr Mistoffelees.
One of the big draws was Judi Dench, who played the faded glamour cat, Grizabella.
My God, I've got to be this cat. I'm going to have to prance all his face for 2 hours or whatever it is. I mean, that frightens me out of my wits. I want to scream it. I'm going to be 47 this year. I can't do that.
Less than a week before the opening night, disaster struck, as Judi Dench was injured during rehearsals. Who could replace her, and fast? A call was made to Elaine Paige.
I have unfortunately missed out on a good 5 weeks intensive rehearsal and trying things out, and that's what I'm sad that I've missed.
Behind the scenes, they were still short of cash, and even Cameron Mackintosh later confessed to being frustrated by the lack of backers.
You know, they wouldn't cough up. And very famous people in the theatre, I will not name, who were offered, even during previews, a quarter of the capital. We were still that short. Went, no, this will never work.
The police fought to establish court.
Just 3 weeks before the opening of Cats, tensions between the police and local residents in Brixton, South London, developed into 3 nights of full-scale rioting. Many feared that television images of London in flames that flashed around the world would put off tourists from visiting the capital and buying tickets for the shows. Cats finally opened on May the 11th, 1981. David Lister of The Independent.
Peter Heppel in The Stage. He wrote, "The British musical has taken a giant leap forward." In the Sunday Times, Derek Jewell, "Cats is among the most exhilarating and innovative musicals ever staged." In The Guardian, Michael Billington, "An exhilarating piece of total theatre." So Irving Wardle of The Times, "The visual spectacle was too overwhelming." Robert Cushman of The Observer, "Flawed but unmissable." So that's fine, because the billboards, they would just take the word unmissable. Doesn't matter if it's flawed.
Trevor Nunn, sitting as you are round the table with all your former colleagues on this show, you knew Judi Dench well, and she knew you well, and therefore you must have been thrilled when she agreed to join the cast of Cats.
We were working together at the time, and Judi said, "What are you up to next?" And I talked to her about Cats, and she said, oh, I would love to be a cat. And I said, no, it's going to be a big dance show. And she said, no, but surely there can be a kind of sleepy old ginger cat. And I mean, I would love to do that. And I told her there was a cat called the Gumby cat, who indeed sits and sits and sits. And she said, "Oh, come on, let me do it." So it was very much an impulse of Judi, who wanted to be in the show. It was a good deal later when the fragment, the full poem of Grizabella, turned up, that I realised that somebody could play the Gumby cat and then change and emerge as Grizabella that much later. So I talked to Judi about playing this second role. She was fascinated by that, and indeed we did rehearse that, and pretty much at that time the accident happened.
Were you there?
I was there when the accident happened. It was very shocking. It was very upsetting. The scream that Judi let up made it absolutely clear that it was more than a conventional rehearsal stumble. And I heard somebody whisper, "Oh my God, the Achilles." And she had indeed snapped her Achilles tendon.
Were in sleep.
We were doing a sort of simple gliding step, and I was standing behind her, and she suddenly went, "Oh," and froze, and she said, "Did you kick me?" And I said, "No," but I realised what it was as well, because I knew it was serious, because you could almost hear it, the ricochet of it, and I didn't say anything.
Elaine Paige, because of this awful accident that had happened to Judi Dench, you got a call, unexpected, totally out of the blue, from Cameron McIntosh.
That's right. And he said to me, would I be interested in coming down to the theatre to discuss the possibility of taking over the role? And I said, when do you start previews? And he said, on Monday, I think it was. So I was slightly concerned about the lack of time that I was going to be given to learn this. I said to him, can you explain to me what the character is, what it's about? And he said, well, by no means, it's not Evita, it's not a leading role, it's very much a cameo role. And I said, well, does the character have a song to sing? And he said, yes. And I said, it wouldn't be called Memory by any chance, would it? And he said, yes, indeed, that's it, but that's the only song you've got. Fate had somehow landed me with this possibility of playing this role. And I can remember Paul going up to me and saying, what are you doing here? Are you mad? We're all cavorting about, prancing about like cats. What are you doing here?
But what did make it possible was that the character of Grizabella was outside the tribe and then visited and was rejected, had to go away again, visited, was rejected, then finally returns and changes the mind of everybody. It was thrilling.
Can I ask you, Trevor, at this point, were you aware that enough money was coming in because of word of mouth, possibly, to fund the production?
I was fascinated when you were talking about investment. Indeed, the figure that I had been given was we are spending £2 million on this show. And in those days, that was a gigantic amount of money. It's virtually an off-Broadway show at the moment. But that was pretty scary. And there was a strong rumour that Andrew had mortgaged one of his properties in order to raise money, in order to get the investment.
I want to ask those of you who were performers, you were presumably also offered the chance to have a stake in this.
I was offered, and being a fabulous businessman, I said, no, thank you. It's very difficult to take a view on something that you're in.
Bonnie?
There were moments that we thought either this is going to be the biggest flop or the biggest hit. It wouldn't just sink away without notice. And to be honest, I think it wasn't until the very first preview that we knew we had anything at all. And I remember Trevor coming on the tannoy system in the dressing rooms after the show, and it was only then that we kind of cheered and breathed out, because he did his usual "Dear Company" speech, "Dear Company," and he said, "Dear Company, we have a show," and we all cheered. Yes.
In 1981, Cats faced some serious competition for the title Hottest Ticket in Town. For instance, a month later came Barnum, based on the life of the circus showman P.T. Barnum.
Modestly billed as the greatest show on earth, Barnum has been packing them in, and Michael Crawford has become synonymous with the role of Phineas T. Barnum, the all-singing, all-dancing star of the show.
It was all to play for at that year's Olivier Awards.
I think it's a straight cat fight, actually. It's either going to be Barnum, the old...
The Guardian's Michael Billington had a hunch he knew which way it might go.
For patriotic reasons, it'd be quite nice if Cats got it.
Ned Sherrin did the big reveal.
Musical of the year is Cats.
T.S. Eliot's widow, Valerie Eliot, picked up the award on behalf of composer Andrew Lloyd Webber.
It gives me great pleasure to accept it on his behalf and that of my husband, T.S. Eliot, Gillian Lynn, Trevor Nunn, John Napier, the superb cast of Cats, and all those who play their parts behind the scenes. Off the back of its success in London, Cats opened on Broadway 16 months later. At the time, it was the most expensive Broadway show ever mounted, with a production cost of $5.5 million. Barry Norman was there for the BBC.
One show clearly destined for success was Cats, which arrived here surrounded by remarkable pre-publicity hype and ballyhoo. The composer is Andrew Lloyd Webber.
When you came here and started casting for the production, did you find there was more talent here than in London?
What there is there's more talent in depth.
The American film actress Betty Buckley took over the role first made famous by Elaine Paige. David Lister again.
Frank Rich, who was known as the butcher of Broadway, he thought it failed to tell a clear, distinctive story, but he concluded that Cats transports the audience into a complete fantasy world, and he called it a wondrous spectacle.
And the winner is Cats.
On the back of that Frank Rich review, Cats won 7 out of 19 Tony Awards at the 1983 ceremony, including Best Director for Trevor Nunn and Best Original Score for Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Wow, is all I can say. And to do it in New York, well, that's the home of musicals, isn't it? I shouldn't say, really, but I do think it was the best show of the season. I mean, it's not for me to say, but it was.
Well, there was Cats winning its first Tony. Was the Broadway show in some respect different from the London one?
The whole notion of the British taking a musical to Broadway, that there was a certain amount of resentment that you sense from the Broadway community. When Cats burst in New York and we got all of those Tony Awards, it was an amazing night, but I want to point out one thing. Something very dark happened that night. Cats won all those Tony Awards until we got to the award for Best Choreography. And we were all expecting Gillian Lynn for Cats, and her name was not read out. It was somebody else. And it felt like it was almost like a... I'm being unnecessarily sinister, but it felt like a plot. It felt like we cannot allow the British into our dance accolade. That's what we Americans do.
Wayne, see, by this stage, surely British dancers were just as good as Broadway.
I know the dancers was good, but the choreography wasn't. We had to wait for an American show to come to England, like Chorus Line or Bob Fosse, his cabaret. before we could see any sort of progression in musical theatre. And they used to bring the whole cast over with them, which was totally unfair, because we weren't allowed to go to America. And to have this one opportunity of a dance show called Cats, well, God, I mean, it was like, I'd gone to heaven, because never was there a musical in London where dance had the priority. If you could sing well or you could act well, you got into a musical and you were allowed to read for a part. If you were a dancer, you wouldn't be allowed to read for a part. They'd think you were thick.
It had always been that dance, you stopped for a dance, or the dancers came on and just entertained in the background and filled the stage. But this was all about the physicality of a cat, and therefore you couldn't break between. It didn't stop. It was consistent.
John Napier.
Because it was going to Broadway, we kind of glossed the cherry, and it became a bit more slick visually, primarily because we were now in a conventional theatre. Also, I think because the funds that were available to do it became astronomical in comparison to what we had in London. And to some extent, I kind of rue that a little bit now. I wish it kind of... But maybe it wouldn't have been as successful worldwide if it had just stayed like the junky, punky thing that I'd done in London.
I think that's the true thing. I think what John's just said is absolutely right. And in a way, it's still kind of... exists today, that you can see something here, a production here in this country, and it has that kind of slightly off, raw kind of quality to it. And you can go and see it in America, and it's exactly the same production, as it were, but there is a slickness to it. But it doesn't necessarily have quite the heart that we have here.
Strangely enough, I saw Evita in America after it opened. And I thought they all looked terribly well fed. So it kind of lost... No, but it did lose a kind of a reality, because they did look terribly...
It's not as real, that's right.
No, it didn't seem as real, I agree.
Real.
Elaine, I think you were in the London production of Cats for about 9 months.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Was it hard to leave, or were you just longing to find a new experience?
It was a strange experience for me, because it was one of those things that Cameron was absolutely right. It was a cameo role. I spent a great deal of time in the dressing room, twiddling my thumbs, not knowing what to do. In fact, it got to the stage where I could kind of wander around the backstage area of the theatre and round to the foyer in the front and have a chat with the front of house staff and things, and even see Paul kind of coming off from Mr Mistoffelees in the audience, coming back to get back on stage, and, just trying to find anybody just to talk to for a few minutes, because it was a dreadfully lonely experience, which actually worked terribly well for the character, because she was this character that was... every time I went on stage, the entire company would leave and I would be left there alone. And then when I'd done my thing, they would all come back and I would limp away.
Cats led to a surge of interest in new musicals across the West End. Willie Russell's Blood Brothers opened in 1983. Followed by Les Miserables in 1985. While the revival of Me and My Girl was another big hit in 1985. And Andrew Lloyd Webber followed Cats with Phantom of the Opera. As the British economy recovered and flourished, there was no shortage of cash-rich theatregoers to lap up each new production. Then, in 1986, Lloyd Webber surprised everyone with his next move.
If you've ever fancied a share in the success of musicals like Evita, Cats and Starlight Express, now's your chance, because today the man behind those box office triumphs, Andrew Lloyd Webber, launched his company, the Really Useful Group, on the stock exchange.
I think I would be very attractive as an investment.
The company was valued at £35 million, with the launch price for shares of £3.20.
With success here, he would find investors all over the place wanting to make money through him. How about you? If I had money, I'd love to do it. Unfortunately, I'm spending it all on these tickets.
The Really Useful Group and Andrew Lloyd Webber had ambitious plans.
Now, at 37, he's taking over the West End.
He's bought the Palace Theatre and plans to restore it.
On the 12th of May 1989, Cats passed an important milestone.
Tonight is the 3,358th performance of Cats, making it the longest-running London musical ever.
13 years later, on the 11th of May 2002, after 21 years, Cats finally came to a close at the New London Theatre. Here's the BBC's arts correspondent, Rosie Millard.
There are hundreds of Cats fans here in the Piazza at Covent Garden, all ready to give this old cat a very good send-off.
The Independent's David Lister.
Well, the word at the time was that Cats had just saturated the audience, so there weren't that many left to see it. But I think then it had done its time.
We're about to begin.
Here we go!
After years of waiting, it was announced earlier this year that there'd be a film version of Cats directed by Tom Hooper. A trailer emerged for the film featuring stars Jennifer Hudson, James Corden, Taylor Swift and Judi Dench. Well, that's apparently part of the new version of Cats, which everybody can see in December of this year, part of the trailer we heard there. But I'd like to ask all of you here, who obviously have a huge affection for the London version, the original London version, what Cats did for you. Elaine?
It was a wonderful stroke of luck on my part. I know it was terrible for Judi, but for me, because of her demise, if you like, with her Achilles heel, it gave me the opportunity of a wonderful role and a wonderful, wonderful song that I still to this day sing, and it's one of those wonderful moments in my life, really.
And Dame Judi, as of course she is now and has been for years, is in the new film of Cats, apparently. Will you be going to see it?
Of course I shall go and see it. I can't wait to go and see it. It looks, it doesn't resemble anything that this group of people put together.
Wayne Sleep, what about you? What's your most enduring memory of the show?
Well, it gave me an opportunity to go into musical theatre, which I'd always wanted to do since I was a kid. I wanted to be Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire. I never wanted to be a ballet dancer. I'd never seen one. But it gave me an opportunity to be able to do jazz, tap, contemporary, and not just classical ballet, and which forms I really loved doing and aspired to.
Paul Nicholas, how about you, and looking back?
I think the great thing for me, really, overall, is the brilliance of Lloyd Webber and being able to perform in one of his shows. Having done Jesus Christ Superstar, now that kind of trips off the tongue now, but if you think back to 1972, to do a musical called Jesus Christ Superstar was quite radical. We all, as performers and artists, owe a great deal to that man. Absolutely. For his the courageous way he writes his musicals. He's not frightened of anything.
You were a lot younger when the London version, all of us around this table, came out. I think at that time, Paul Nicholas, you must have been rather thrilled to meet Ginger Rogers.
Yes,
how did that happen?
Well, we did have a lot of celebrities because it became a hit show, and when you have a hit show, you get celebrities coming along, and indeed, I know that Ginger Rogers came back, and of course we all had heard from
we all had to do a little dance.
We did, and we all the men had a little dance so that we could say that we danced with Ginger Rogers. And indeed, we can still say, and we will. The point of that story is that the show became very fashionable, and it's very important for a West End show to become fashionable, and for stars and people like that to come and see the show because it spreads word of mouth on the show.
Bonnie?
I do remember Barbara Streisand coming to see the show.
Oh. She left in the interval.
Yes, she did. She
arrived late at the beginning.
She wanted to come incognito, and she was wearing white. She was brought through the stage door when she was wearing a white outfit with a gold turban. I thought she had a gold turban on.
So nobody could notice
I mean,
her.
literally. And then she left at the interval saying that she had a headache. And then she went and recorded the song, having never heard you, Elaine, sing the thing at all.
The one thing about Bonnie was that you could never take a night off with Bonnie around, because she said, well, why couldn't you come in? What's wrong with you? So this 16-year-old kid was like...
Telling us off.
She's a very disciplined lady, and she made sure that everyone else was.
Sorry. Trevor, how about you? You're doing Cats in Vienna as we speak.
Indeed. There is a production of Cats about to go ahead in Vienna, and it's in German. But I think I've been involved in presenting Cats more than 20 times over the years, and every single time that I'm involved, I hear something new in the score. I hear unexpected connections. That score is amazingly rich, amazingly inventive, amazingly groundbreaking. And when I think back, that it was a score that was created to begin with in no particular order, and yet when you hear it now, it's as if somehow magically it was given a through line. In Vienna at the moment there is the biggest orchestra that we've ever had, because they employ a huge number of musicians permanently in that country. So we have something like 30 people in the pit, and it actually was so thrilling just to listen to a larger orchestra play the score, to the point where I was thinking this could expand if Andrew wanted to do it, to the point where you could do a Cats symphony and you could give it to the London Symphony Orchestra and people would go wild for it. It's that good.
I was going to say, would you do it all again? But you are doing it all again.
I've never stopped.
And John Napier, in a way, you did manage to change the way we think of an immobile stage to something that could be all sorts of shapes.
Yeah, and it was, this, in a way, the start of an international career. So once Cats had opened on Broadway, I mean, I was getting phone calls from Steven Spielberg or, so many people. Well, then along came a few other things.
There were plenty of offers.
It's a strange one for me because I'm not a performer. I'm not there every night. I'm not involved in the actual structure of the narrative or anything. I'm just a boy with a pencil that travels.
John Napier, Bonnie Langford, Elaine Paige, Sir Trevor Nunn, Paul Nicholas and Wayne Sleep. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Brilliantly done.
So many memories.
The Reunion was produced by Howard Shannon. The series producer is David Prest. And that was the last in the current run. But all the previous episodes are available from BBC Sounds. And on the Radio 4 website, Sue MacGregor selects some of her favourites. The Reunion is a Whistledown production for BBC Radio 4.